The enemy in this video is not a foreign government. It is not a hostile regulator. It is not a bank that publicly dismissed crypto while quietly building on blockchain rails. The enemy is something that most Americans interact with every single day without thinking about it as a risk. It is the dollar, not in a conspiracy theory sense, not in a gold bug sense, in a specific documented Congressional Budget Office sourced, Federal Reserve acknowledged FX Street, analyzed sense that is becoming harder to ignore in the second half of 2026, and the unsexy truth that sits underneath the title of this video. The truth that most content covering XRP, XLM, and HBAR never says clearly enough is that the case for Americans needing these assets sooner than expected is not primarily about getting rich. It is about what happens to purchasing power, to savings, to retirement accounts, to the value of every dollar Americans have worked to accumulate in an environment where the most credible financial institutions in the world are starting to publish research that says the dollar's position is structurally challenged in ways that are not temporary or cyclical. Let me give you the specific data before I give you the argument, because the argument only stands if the data is real. The Congressional Budget Office projects a federal deficit of approximately $1.9 trillion in fiscal year 2026, with deficits rising further over the coming decade. $1.9 trillion. That is not a rounding error. That is the gap between what the U.S. government spends and what it collects in taxes, growing annually, being financed by Treasury issuance that requires buyers willing to absorb ever-increasing U.S. government debt. The interest cost on that debt at 4.48%, 10-year Treasury yield, is itself becoming one of the largest line items in the federal budget. Interest payments on the national debt are on track to exceed defense spending. That is not a projection from a fringe economist. That is the documented trajectory of U.S. fiscal policy as of the time of recording. The U.S. dollar depreciated 7.4% over 2025. It recovered modestly in the first half of 2026, partly because the Bank of America rate hike forecast for September, October, and December pushed yields higher, making dollar-denominated assets temporarily more attractive to foreign investors who need yield. But the FX Street mid-year analysis published in July 2026 said something that deserves to be read clearly. Concerns over tariffs, fiscal sustainability, and the institutional independence of the Federal Reserve are becoming harder to ignore. The dollar remains expensive in real historical terms, and heavy Treasury issuance and growing interest costs are likely to keep upward pressure on yields in ways that create additional fiscal sustainability questions. Institutional independence of the Federal Reserve. That phrase, in a mainstream FX analysis from a credible financial publication, is the most significant signal in that entire paragraph. The Federal Reserve's institutional independence is the foundational assumption of the dollar's reserve currency credibility. It is the reason foreign central banks hold dollars, the reason treasury markets function at the depth and liquidity they do, the reason the dollar has maintained its reserve status despite the documented decline from 72% of global reserves in 2001 to below 57% today. If that independence is being publicly questioned in mainstream financial analysis, the erosion of the dollar's reserve position is not a fringe concern. It is a documented institutional process. Now here is where the SWIFT decision becomes the most important honest counterweight in this entire video. And I'm not going to skip it because it is the single most significant piece of evidence against the narrative that XRP, XLM, and HBAR are the natural recipients of the institutional payment infrastructure transition. SWIFT announced in July 2026 that its own blockchain ledger is ready for use, built on Consensus's Linea. 17 banks are prepared to pilot live transactions. SWIFT, which connects over 11,500 financial institutions and moves the equivalent of world GDP every 2 to 3 days, chose not to build on XRP Ledger, not on Stellar, not on Hedera. It built something it controls on an Ethereum layer 2 that it could configure, govern, and operate according to its own institutional requirements without depending on a public network it does not own. This is the enemy within the thesis. Not SWIFT as an institution, but SWIFT's decision as a data point. Because what it reveals is a specific tension between the institutional adoption story for XRP, XLM, and HBAR and the institutional preference for control that the largest players in global finance consistently demonstrate when given the choice. SWIFT does not want to depend on a public network. It wants infrastructure it governs. And if SWIFT, which is the most consequential cross-border payment institution on Earth, makes that choice, the question for every holder of XRP, XLM, and HBAR is honest and specific. Is the institutional adoption thesis dependent on large institutions being willing to use public networks they do not control? And what does SWIFT's linear choice tell you about how frequently the largest institutions make that specific concession? The honest answer is that SWIFT's linear choice is a warning that the institutional adoption of public blockchains is not inevitable for every use case. The institutions that most need efficient cross-border payment infrastructure, the largest ones, also have the most motivation to build alternatives they control, rather than depending on public networks they do not influence. But here is where the American need argument diverges from the institutional adoption argument in a way that most content on these assets never separates clearly. Americans do not need XRP, XLM, and HBAR because SWIFT chose Linea. Americans may need XRP, XLM, and HBAR because of what is happening to the dollar while SWIFT is building on Linea. Those are different arguments with different evidence requirements, and the dollar argument, the real purchasing power argument, does not depend on whether SWIFT chooses Stellar over Linea, or whether HBAR gets into the DTCC multi-chain integration before the year ends. It depends on the specific documented fiscal conditions that the CBO, the FX Street analysis, and the reserve share decline from 72.5% are collectively describing. Let me make the American need argument specifically, and I want to do it in 3 parts because each part is independent and each part stands or falls on its own evidence. The first part is the savings erosion argument. Americans who hold savings in dollar-denominated accounts, checking accounts, savings accounts, money market funds, short-duration treasury positions experience 7.4% purchasing power erosion in 2025. In 2024, the erosion was different, but the cumulative effect over the last 5 years of the dollar's volatility, inflation, and fiscal pressure has been a measurable reduction in the real purchasing power of dollar savings. Americans who held their savings in assets that appreciated against the dollar, equities, real estate, gold preserved purchasing power. Americans who held purely in dollar-denominated savings did not. The real purchasing power frame for XRP, XLM, and HBAR is this. If these 3 assets participate in any portion of the institutional modernization of payment and settlement infrastructure over the next 5 years, and the documented evidence of MasterCard picking XRP's Ledger for card settlement, MoneyGram choosing Stellar for its dollar stablecoin, Lloyd's Banking Group endorsing Hedera for FX collateral, the DTCC confirming Stellar for tokenization, and Charles Schwab and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs publicly pushing for the Clarity Act that gives these assets statutory protection, represents the most specific institutional validation these assets have ever had simultaneously. Then holding a portion of savings in these assets is not a speculative bet on crypto. It is a documented hedge against the purchasing power erosion that dollar-only savings have demonstrated over the last 5 years. Americans who are holding exclusively in dollar-denominated savings are exposed to a specific and documented risk. And Americans who hold a portion in assets that are being validated by the same institutional ecosystem that manages the world's financial infrastructure are exposed to a different risk profile. Neither is risk-free, but the risks are different. And in an environment where the CBO is projecting $1.9 trillion annual deficits, with deficits rising where the dollar has already demonstrated 7.4% annual depreciation, and where institutional independence concerns are appearing in mainstream financial analysis, the case for some allocation to assets that are not dollar-denominated savings is not a fringe argument. It is the same argument that every sophisticated investor has been making about gold, about equities, about real estate for 50 years. The second part is the payment efficiency argument. Americans spend approximately $350 billion annually in international remittance flows, money sent from the United States to family members in other countries. The average cost of those remittances through traditional channels is approximately 6% of the amount sent. 6% on $350 billion. That's $21 billion per year paid by Americans, predominantly lower-income Americans who are sending money to family in Mexico, the Philippines, India, Nigeria, and dozens of other countries in fees to intermediary banks and money transfer operators for the privilege of moving their own money across a border, XRP's on-demand liquidity corridors, Stellar's MoneyGram integration operating across 180 countries, and the documented remittance infrastructure that these networks have built over years represent a specific and verifiable answer to that $21 billion annual fee burden, not in the future. In production corridors right now, the Bitcoin XRP corridor for U.S.-Mexico remittances, the coin's PH corridor for U.S. Philippines transfers, the MoneyGram Stellar integration, Americans using these corridors pay a fraction of the 6% average. The savings are documented. The technology is working. The question is not whether the efficiency exists. It is whether Americans know about it and whether the regulatory environment allows them to access it easily. The Clarity Act, Charles Schwab and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and Fidelity and Bank of America all publicly pushing for passage as of July 27, 2026, is the legislation that makes the regulatory environment answer yes to that second question. Statutory clarity for these assets means the banks and fintechs that serve the American remittance market can build XRP and XLM and HBAR-based products without the compliance risks that currently makes most regulated financial institutions reluctant to deploy them at retail scale. Americans need cheaper remittances. These assets provide them. The Clarity Act makes the mainstream delivery of that benefit possible. The third part is the most uncomfortable argument and the one most likely to be dismissed as speculative, but the FX Street Analysis published it in mainstream financial media this month, and that makes it worth saying directly. If the institutional independence of the Federal Reserve is genuinely under pressure, if the political dynamics around the Fed's rate decisions, its mandate, and its governance structure produce a period where dollar monetary policy is perceived as less credible internationally, the reserve share decline that has already moved from 72 to 57% could accelerate, not to zero, not this year, but at a pace that produces dollar volatility that is not like anything most Americans have experienced in their lifetimes. Americans who lived through Weimar Germany or Argentina's repeated currency crises or Zimbabwe's hyperinflation did not plan for those events. They did not hold assets diversified against them in advance. They watched purchasing power disappear in real time without the tools to protect against it because they had not needed those tools before and did not understand they needed them until it was too late. Nobody is predicting those outcomes for the United States. The dollar has structural advantages in reserve currency status, in the depth of U.S. Treasury markets, in the global financial system's dependency on dollar infrastructure that make those outcomes genuinely remote, but remote is not zero, and the specific documented fiscal conditions, 19 trillion deficit, growing interest burden, reserve share declining from 72 to 57%, and institutional independence questions appearing in mainstream financial analysis mean that the argument for some allocation to assets that are not dollar denominated is no longer confined to fringe investors and gold bugs. It is appearing in FX Street, in the Congressional Budget Office, in the reserve share data that central banks publish. Americans may need XRP, XLM, and HBAR sooner than expected. But not because these assets are going to make everyone rich. Some will not. The swift linear decision is a genuine warning that institutional adoption of public blockchains is not inevitable for every use case. The 2026 performance, XRP down 65% over the past year, XLM down 59%, HBR down 75%, is a genuine data point about the gap between institutional adoption narratives and short-term price performance. But the purchasing power erosion from dollar savings is not a narrative. It is documented to the $21 billion annual American remittance fee burden is not a narrative. It is documented. The $1.9 trillion deficit and the reserve share decline are not narratives. They are documented. And the institutional bloc, Charles Schwab, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, Fidelity, and Bank of America, publicly pushing for the Clarity Act that gives these assets statutory protection, is not a narrative. It was published yesterday. The convergence of those documented conditions is why Americans may need these assets sooner than expected, not as a speculative bet, as a specific response to specific documented pressures on the system that stores, transfers, and preserves the value of every dollar Americans have worked to accumulate. SWIFT will build what SWIFT wants to build on Linea. The institutional adoption of public blockchains will be partial, contested, and slower than the most optimistic community members' project. The dollar will not collapse this year or next, or probably in any year most people watching this video will live through. None of those honest concessions change the specific documented case for Americans holding some exposure to XRP, XLM, and HBR as a hedge against the specific risks the dollar is demonstrably carrying right now. The question is not whether you believe in these assets as investments. The question is whether the specific documented risks to the dollar's purchasing power, to remittance efficiency, and to the institutional independence that underpins reserve currency credibility are risks you want to be entirely unhedged against. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here constitutes financial, legal, or investment advice. Always do your own research and consult qualified professionals before making any financial decisions. If this video gave you the specific documented case for why Americans may need these assets, not the price prediction case, the purchasing power and payment efficiency and fiscal risk case, please smash that like button, because the Americans who need to see this argument are not the crypto community. They are the people holding dollar savings who have never thought about these assets as anything other than speculation. The like puts them in front of them. Subscribe, because this channel makes the honest argument, including the swift linear counterweight rather than the comfortable one. The case for these assets is stronger when it includes the counter-arguments than when it pretends they don't exist. Here's the question I want in the comments. Straight answer. Are you holding XRP, XLM, and HBAR as a financial bet on price appreciation or as a specific hedge against something documented and real happening to the dollar and the US financial system? Not what sounds better, your actual reason, because the answer to that question determines whether the swift linear decision and the 2026 price performance change anything about your conviction, or whether they are noise against a thesis that was never primarily about price. Have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to join my free Telegram community with the link on my channel where I post my daily crypto experience and arbitrage opportunities you can't get anywhere else. This is XRP Colbert signing off.